1 employee out of 3 has already experienced bullying in the workplace themselves. And almost 3 million employees are really affected by bullying. And facts, figures, backgrounds make it very, very clear to us that bullying is a real leadership challenge. Bullying in the workplace. 6.5% of employees in Germany report bullying experience in the workplace, according to a representative study from 225. So the numbers are really very, very current. Mental illnesses now cause over 17% of all days absent in Germany. And depression is again the most common cause of mentally related absences, and that above all after COVID. Bullying often leads to emotional exhaustion, but of course also inability to work and termination. In France, every second person resigns after bullying experience. In Germany, it's a bit less, but resignations are, of course, also a solution for many bullied people. Young employees, so between 18 to 30, are twice as often affected as the average. And that is often because they are simply still in very dependent employment relationships. Women are 1.6 times more often affected than men, but men bully more often in leadership positions. Women also get help faster than men, but the number of unreported cases remains relatively high because only every second person gets support. The costs of bullying are really, yes, very, very impressive. In production losses, the sum is about 7 billion euros, according to estimates from various different studies. So the EAHAE, or Health Insurance Labor Research, and the illness costs due to bullying are about 3 billion euros. And according to various studies, the absences for bullied people are between 5 and 9 days higher than for non-bullied people. So the total costs, economic total costs, are about 10 billion euros per year. These are really horrendously high sums. And if we go a bit further there, then various frontline professions really have an increased bullying and stress risk. Above all in healthcare, nursing, and elderly care, the bullying risks are extremely high, and of course also in education, schools, daycare centers, universities. And the third professional stress, or the third professional stress risk, we find in public administrations, above all social services, but also in security services like police, rescue, and fire department. The consequences for those affected, for organization, and for society in general are, of course, also severe. So for those affected, the consequences are often mental and physical burdens like anxiety, depression, stress, of course also sleep disorders, heart and circulatory problems. And in general, these consequences lead to a reduced quality of life and longer term also an increased risk of illnesses. For the organization, the companies, we have above all a decreasing motivation and performance as a consequence. Also more conflicts, bad working climate, higher absences, higher fluctuation, because as said, 10 to 20% who leave the company to escape this bullying situation. Of course, also production losses, and we have a quality defect as a further consequence, to name only some of the consequences. And for society in general, there are extreme costs in healthcare, burden on social security, but also loss of skilled workers. And the overall economic burden for Germany is relatively high. We have seen it about 10 billion euros per year. And by the way, costs one bullying case per company between 5,000 and 15,000 euros per year. And it can even go higher, up to 50,000, depending on status. If we go a bit further, we can find that, of course, the companies have prevention and countermeasures. And that on all three levels, company, HR, and also individual level. On company level, there are the ethics charters, but of course also leadership training, feedback culture, conflict management, and team buildings, which develop more and more as prevention measure. On HR level, we then have the reporting procedures or the obligation to report that, internal mediation, and more or less clear sanctions. And on individual level, we have seen it only every second person looks for support, and those who then look for support do it mostly also on private level, so documentation, social media. Some look for psychological support, others keep a bullying diary, and so on and so forth. So we can say that there are prevention and countermeasures, but they are not enough, because studies have shown that the increase in the number of affected people since 221 is almost plus 13%. That means that countermeasures exist, but therefore bullying does not decrease. No, quite the opposite, right? Bullying increases. And that is, by the way, the case Europe-wide, so not only related to Germany. So let's look at what bullying actually is exactly, how that is defined. So, according to the University of Leipzig, is defined under bullying frequently recurring, persisting negative behaviors towards a person that triggers defensiveness or helplessness. And by the way, according to definition, these behaviors must take place over weeks or even over months, that it is actually as bullying registered can be. So what is not bullying? Because sometimes one has the impression, yes, I am being bullied, but let's look at what is not bullying. A single conflict is not bullying, can happen in the company. One can really be in conflict with a colleague, with manager, or with the management. So single conflict is not bullying. A normal criticism that is communicated more or less respectfully is also no bullying case. Short-term incidents, well, I think of a manager who simply, if I may say so, blows his top because he is stressed and apologizes afterwards, and that never happens again, is of course also no bullying. Can happen, should not happen, but can. Yes, and legitimate work instructions, even if they are occasionally perceived as unfair, are also no bullying. Let's note that not every conflict is bullying, but every bullying generally begins with a conflict that is targeted, directed against a person. There are three forms of bullying: horizontal, top-down, and mixed forms. The horizontal form, so among colleagues, peer-to-peer, is the most widespread. So over half or even 70% of the bullying forms or bullying takes place among colleagues. So really horizontal. Typical mechanisms are exclusion, rumors, subtle devaluation, or peer pressure that is directed against a person. And then we have top-down, so supervisor, employee, which is also called bossing. The typical forms: systematic belittling, excessive control, isolation, or unfair work distribution over a longer period of time. And systematic belittling is also expressed by the fact that there is constantly negative criticism, but when the employee does something positive, it is simply not highlighted. So it is simply ignored. And mixed forms are frequently to be found in conflictual organizational cultures, and their bullying is not necessarily actively triggered by leadership, but bullying is made possible, so on horizontal level or not stopped. Bullying is not just a simple perpetrator-victim phenomenon, although it's very, very often portrayed that way. There's a manager who bullies a person or a colleague who bullies a co-worker. But let's really look at this systemically, approach it that way. So bullying usually arises from a poor organizational climate or inadequate leadership behavior, lack of intervention, or group dynamics that simply find bullying normal or practice bullying without being aware of it or that it is bullying. By the way, the day before yesterday, a police officer called me who has been in burnout for 8 months. And as I was discussing it a bit with her, she told me, Petra, what hurt me the most is that my manager just stood by and watched for so long. So a lack of intervention from managers is really a very, very sensitive issue and very, very painful for people being bullied. How does bullying happen? Well, there are 3 factors: organizational factors, person-to-person factors, and cultural factors. And usually bullying arises from the interplay of organization, leadership, culture, but of course also individual factors. Concretely, for organizations, this means poor communication, often internal competition, restructuring, and simply temporary stressful situations caused by external factors or economic factors. As far as personal factors are concerned, that depends heavily on a person's personality, but also on their vulnerability. So there are highly sensitive people who might be a bit more sensitive to criticism and then also perceived difference. So from people who come from a really different culture, or sometimes also older people who are just a bit slower, just to name a few. And as for corporate culture, there we find the leadership style again, either too authoritarian, too controlling, too laissez-faire, or a lack of conflict culture, or even silence as a norm. Yeah, you don't even need to complain. With us, it's always like that. Yeah, the boss, that's just how he is. You don't need to get upset about it. Everything is kind of minimized, downplayed, and seen as normal. Lack of appreciation and recognition, we already discussed that. Strong competitive thinking, kind of this dog-eat-dog culture, where everyone pushes the other a bit just to make themselves look better than better, or a lack of diversity and tolerance. If we look at bullying from a leadership perspective, bullying is rarely people problem, but almost always a system that is dysregulated. And typical drivers in such dysregulated systems are unclear roles and expectations, high pressure to perform, lack of conflict resolution, but also weak and inconsistent leadership and cultural turning a blind eye, like this silent acceptance. Nobody says anything. Yeah. Everyone is more or less maybe also afraid of sanctions or afraid of being bullied themselves. If we look at bullying from a neurobiological perspective, we find that under chronic stress, our nervous system is increasingly activated. And that can then express itself in fight reactions or withdrawal, flight reactions, but also mistrust and emotional overreactions. And that can, of course, also lead to increased conflicts or polarization or social tensions, and in the worst case, of course, burnout. So let's note, bullying dynamics arise more easily in dysregulated systems. And what is very interesting is this. The dysregulated system really affects both sides, both the leader and those affected. They can get caught in these above-mentioned destructive patterns without being aware of it. And especially managers are often under stress, and they are constantly, or more or less constantly, in a fight reaction. And that explains why some managers, without intending to, fall into some bullying behaviors so automatically. So it's no excuse, quite the contrary, but it partly explains why some managers bully without being aware of it. And by the way, I explain this really very, very precisely in my ebook, which, Andrea, I didn't say, but which in September, it partly explains why some managers bully without being aware of it. Ship issue, because leaders directly influence psychological safety, communication culture, of course, also conflict management and team dynamics. And we see bullying as a real leadership challenge. And we completely agree with what the Federal Institute for Occupational Safety and State Health very, very clearly say, or as part of psychosocial risks. Maybe you've asked yourselves now, well, so what can I do as a manager, or are there any behaviors that I can perhaps identify to intervene early, especially if it's among colleagues? And there we have very clear behaviors that can really be observed. So in the team, social exclusion, sometimes also sarcasm or subtle devaluation or rumors, blaming, withdrawal of individual employees, or increasing conflict density. So these are all signs that bullying might already exist or could be developing, and the possible consequences for bullied people are exhaustion. We managers can also see that very clearly, right? When a person is constantly tired or complains of sleep disorders, has increased error rates or concentration problems, or simply reacts in an overstrained emotional way. And we managers can really observe that very, very well. And we have this kind of protective role, so leadership as a protective factor can or should serve to ensure that we managers address tensions really very early on, create clarity, but also promote co-regulation and thereby enable psychological safety. And bullying often begins quietly and escalates where uncertainty and fear dominate. I repeat, so we managers can really have a protective role there and simply address tensions really, really early, and above all, address them respectfully.